Jordan Peterson is one of the many right-leaning folks who hate the idea of redistributing wealth and seem perfectly fine with it being concentrated in the hands of a few people while others are starving. But if some guys get laid more than others, well then it's time for some redistribution. Here's the relevant portion of the New York Times interview in which Peterson discusses what he calls enforced monogamy. Recently, a young man named Alec Manassian drove through Toronto trying to kill people with his van. 10 were killed, and he has been charged with first-degree murder for their deaths and with attempted murder for 16 people who were injured. Mr. Manassian declared himself to be part of a misogynist group whose members call themselves incels. The term is short for involuntary celibates. Though the group has evolved into a male supremacist movement made up of people, some celibate, some not, who believe that women should be treated as sexual objects with few rights. Some believe in forced sexual redistribution in which a governing body would intervene in women's lives to force them into sexual relationships. Violent attacks are what happens when men do not have partners, Mr. Peterson says, and society needs to work to make sure those men are married. He was angry at God because women were rejecting him, Mr. Peterson says of the Toronto killer. The cure for that is enforced monogamy. That's actually why monogamy emerges. Mr. Peterson does not pause when he says this. Enforced monogamy is, to him, simply a rational solution. Otherwise, women will all only go for the most high-status men, he explains. And that couldn't make either gender happy in the end. Half the men fail, he says, meaning that they don't procreate, and no one cares about the men who fail. I laugh because it is absurd. You're laughing about them, he says, giving me a disappointed look. That's because you're female. Says the guy who hates identity politics. It's more than a little ironic that Peterson has no problem telling a woman that her perspective is shaped by her womanhood, but when Michael Eric Dyson dared to suggest that maybe Peterson's perspective is influenced by the fact that he's been a white guy all his life, he started indignantly clutching his pearls. But aside from interventions that would redistribute sex, Mr. Peterson is staunchly against what he calls equality of outcomes, or efforts to equalize society. He usually calls them pathological or evil. He agrees that this is inconsistent, but preventing hordes of single men from violence, he believes, is necessary for the stability of society. Enforced monogamy helps neutralize that. It's interesting that Peterson wants to do something about sexual partners being disproportionately concentrated to a few high-status men, given what he knows about economic inequality. He understands that economic inequality seems to be closely correlated to violence and social instability.
Now, what's really interesting about the Gini coefficient is that if you go to places where everyone, roughly speaking, is poor, say by national standards, I think South Dakota was often used as an example, or maybe one of the maritime provinces, like Newfoundland.
Newfoundland is not a maritime province, by the way.
Where there's low average income, but it's pretty flat distribution. There's almost no crime. And if you go to places where everyone's rich, then there's almost no crime. But if you go places where there are poor people and moderately well-off people and rich people, and the distribution is really steep, then the rate of aggressive behavior among young men, and it's usually within their own ethnic group, starts to skyrocket out of control.
According to the Times, Peterson is opposed to efforts to equalize society, but apparently he's not opposed to efforts to equalize society with respect to how many sexual partners people have. And he agrees that this is inconsistent. I guess it's good that he understands that he's a hypocrite. He justifies his position on sexual redistribution by saying that preventing hordes of single men from violence is necessary for the stability of society. But given that economic inequality also undermines the stability of society, shouldn't he want to do something about that? Forcing millionaires and billionaires to pay more in taxes, let's say to fund a basic income, would help mitigate violence and social instability, and seems to me to be far less of an imposition on people's freedom than getting all up in our personal lives about how many sexual partners we have. Call me crazy. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.